Good afternoon. As we wait for people to join us today, I want to thank you so much for joining us on a timely discussion on U.S.-Israel policy in the second Trump administration. I'm Rachel Rosen. I'm the Chief Communications Officer here at DMFI. On behalf of our staff, our board, our president, Mark Melman, our board co-chairs, Ann Lewis and Todd Richmond, welcome. We appreciate your taking time on a Wednesday afternoon to join us today. If you're interested in DMFI and if you like what you're hearing, I encourage you to please consider following us on social media. We're on X, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. We're now on Blue Sky as well. You can sign up for our news and updates over at dmfi.org. And today, if you'd like to ask a question, there's a couple of ways to do that. You can put your question into the Q&A feature in Zoom, or if you're on Facebook, you can type it into the comment section. And now I'm very pleased to turn it over to our board member, Ed Kelly. And Ed is also the general president of the International Association of Firefighters. And Ed will introduce our distinguished speakers. Ed?
Rachel, thank you very much, and welcome to all of our friends who have joined us today. We're very lucky to have two of the most leading minds in Middle Eastern and Israeli studies. I'd like to welcome first David Makovsky. David is the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute and the director of the Koret Project on Arab-Israel relations. David previously worked in the Office of the United States Secretary of State, serving as a senior advisor to the Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. He co-authored with Ambassador Dana Stroul the book, Be Strong and of Good Courage, How Israel's Most Important Leaders Shaped Its Destiny. He's also an award-winning journalist that covered the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and hosts the podcast, Decision Points. We're pleased to welcome David here today. David? I think you're muted, Dave.
Okay, I hope you can hear me all right. I want to thank you, Ed, for having me. I want to thank Mark Melman, along dear friend, Rachel Rosen, the whole team, Ann Lewis, everyone at DMFI. It's great to be back with you. It's great to be on with my colleague and friend, Dana Stroul. And hopefully between the two of us, you'll get a little bit of a sense of how we see things and then look forward to the discussion after brief remarks. Look, what I wanted to do is to try to look ahead at 2025. Israel's facing multiple fronts, and what are the key decisions it has to make, and how does Trump and the Trump administration, does it impact the trajectory of those decisions and of U.S.-Israel relations on issues relating to the Mideast? So I'm just going to go very telegraphically because I don't want to take up too much time. I would say here, I could think of really like four big decisions, and each one has subcomponents. I would say the first one is Gaza stabilization. What happens? I think there's a real chance that the prime minister will announce an end to major operations around the time of President Trump taking office, even if there's continued pockets of fighting in places like Jabalia and other places. But it's clearly not at the order of magnitude that it was since October the 7th, since the war. Israel had 360,000 reservists, many in Gaza, and now it's just a small fraction of soldiers Israel has left. Israel doesn't want to declare an end of operations yet because hoping to do a deal with the hostages. But it's clear that Trump would like to be able to announce something big when it comes to the war. And so I think Netanyahu was going to try to see, can he have it both ways and announce the end of major operations along, because it's been already a while since the Rafah campaign of over the summer. And so the question is, does Israel stay in Gaza? Does it stay until the hostages are out? Does it stay because people like Finance Minister Smotrich wants Israel to occupy Gaza so they can build settlements or have a military administration? It was clear that one of the tension points between Netanyahu and Gallant, his defense minister, who he just fired, was about that issue. It wasn't the only issue. It was one issue where it was clear Gallant thought that Israel could not afford to stay, didn't have the reserve days, a year of people already there for months and months of reserve duty, and that's without having to feed and be in charge of over 2 million Palestinians in Gaza? Or is the model Area B, like in the West Bank? But what you have in the West Bank is you have a PA, you have a Palestinian Authority. So is that gonna, right now, Smotrich just doesn't, no way do they want a PA. People have talked about some sort of combination with Arab partners, but they're clearly not going to take on Hamas for Israel. So will the PA be allowed to come back under some semblance that will look like the West Bank, I think is a big question. And I think here the US angle will be to say, like the Emiratis would like, which is have the PA come back, but it be under a newly empowered prime minister who has a track record for success. Someone like Salam Fayyad. There's not many like Salam Fayyad. There's one or two others I can think of. So does the U.S. seek to intervene in terms of the shape of does Israel stay in Gaza or not, even after major operations are declared over? So I think that's one question. The second question is Lebanon, obviously, which is, can this ceasefire hold? How reliable is it? For Israel, the success is, will people come back to their homes in the north? 68,000 people. And I think, we're seeing Amos Hochstein, who's the president's envoy. He's trying to work this issue. He's in Beirut this week, supposed to go to Israel. It comes down to, I think Israel doesn't think it's going to get into the agreement. I don't think something that gives Israel a right to intervene whenever it deems a violation. But I think Israel will be content with a side letter from or to the United States and having the US say, well, if there's violations, then and no one deals with those violations of the ceasefire, then Israel's right to intervene. So I think this question of, will the US back Israel's interpretation of violations? Clearly, Israel would like to see CENTCOM, the US Central Command of the military that has excellent relations with, that it somehow be somewhat of a judge when it comes to violations. But Israel clearly wants, a freedom of action if there is violations. But the question is interpreting whether violations have occurred. And I think that's going to be an issue. So it's about the enforcement of the ceasefire. The third issue is Iran. Clearly, you've had this extraordinary sense of back and forth. On October 26th, Israel basically ruled the skies of the Iranian airspace, 140 planes. A lot of it was not even done from Iran's airspace, it was done from Iraqi airspace, but all the planes got back safely and all the S-300s were knocked out. All the air defenses of Iran were knocked out. And our understanding is that a U.S. official has said that no shots were even taken by the S-300 against any Israeli planes on October 26th. So this is extraordinary. People know David likes sports analogies. So I would say, think of a hockey game or a soccer game, and the other side has got no goalie. They have nobody doing defense when you have no air defenses. And I think the U.S. position is that given the war in Ukraine, Russia doesn't have spare S-300s to send to Iran, even if Iran would want it, even though it wasn't effective on October 26th. So you could say right now what we're seeing this week is Iran using its usual diplomatic playbook when it feels like it's in a corner, that Israel could just come and hit the nuclear infrastructure. Suddenly it tells the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, we're willing to create a new baseline, what they call 60% enrichment. That's the nuclear fuel. It takes only 12 days, I believe, to go from 60 to 90%, which is enough for a bomb. That's how the U.S. officials have testified on the Hill. So it's a clear effort, I think a transparent effort by Iran to constrain an Israeli military action by saying, oh, no, we're willing to go the diplomatic route. I mean, it's only because they're in the corner. And so does Israel hit militarily? That's going to be a big issue. Clearly, Israel's going to want to, be in sync with the Trump people on this. Does the new administration give its backing for an Israeli attack on infrastructure with them having no goalie at this time? Or some people say, look, the U.S. can't act, Israel can't act and effectively hit the nuclear infrastructure without the United States because of the MOP, the massive ordnance penetrator that could penetrate through mountains and hit Fordo, where there's been a big nuclear installation. Israel needs the US. Some would say, look, Trump doesn't want new wars. He has an aversion to it. So he's going to want to just focus on maximum pressure and try to keep the focus on economics. So I think a big question is, does this war go up a huge notch from where it is now to the nuclear, from hitting military targets, which Israel did on October 26th or not? I think that's a big thing. And the last big one is, and these are two issues that are seemingly unconnected, but I would like to argue here that they are very much connected. And that is the question of, does Smotrich, the finance minister, try to annex 60% of the West Bank, known as Area C? Remember, the Palestinians are in about 39%. That's called the cities, Area A, the environs around the cities, Area B. So 39% and 61%, to be more precise, on the Israeli side. Does he call for annexation? Or is he trying to collapse the PA, which I worry he is, by using the banking system in Israel? It's a technical word. The corresponding bankings cut off the Palestinian banking system from the world. So it's hard for me to see how an annexation campaign is going to work in tandem with the one thing that I think could lure Donald Trump to the Arab-Israeli space, and that is a Saudi mega deal. I'm sure his advisors telling him, if you do this deal, it's not just Abraham Accords 2.0, it is a Nobel Peace Prize, it is the deal of the century, literally, and you will, this is the Super Bowl of all peace treaties, the World Cup, Donald, this is yours. And that, I think, has a huge allure to him. Right now, the Saudis, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, sees normalization with Israel as part of a mega deal where he gets the prize he wants, which is a U.S. Saudi defense treaty, believing the Saudis have no NATO. If there's an Iranian attack, there's no contractual obligations for the U.S. to defend Saudi Arabia against Iran. So, you know, I think right now, the reason why the mega deal didn't happen is because since October the 7th, the Gaza war, even if MBS doesn't care that much for the Palestinians, he feels the Muslim world cares, the Arab world cares. He can't be seen as selling them out. So he's linked a deal with this, because the U.S. said, look, you're not going to get a defense treaty. We haven't had one since 1960. You're only going to get a deal if to get 67 senators, that's 2/3 of the Senate, you need a lot of people to raise their finger. And only that will happen is if you do something with Israel. So I think that's still the logic. MBS doesn't have the hangups of the older generation. They go, sure, you know, Israel's good. They're against Iran. We're against Iran. You know, we could work together, but I need something on the Palestinians that I could tell my people that we're working towards a two-state solution. And that's something that Netanyahu feels he can't say under this coalition with Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. So the question will be is, you know, what wins out? Annexation in 2025 or normalization? I think there's tensions within, you know, Jared Kushner, who's not going to go in, but is clearly, in my view, going to be very influential on the outside. Why doesn't he go in? He's got a $3 billion equity fund, $2 billion funded by Saudi Arabia, some by the UAE, some by Qatar. He's going to be influential, but he doesn't want to be a government employee because he's got other things going on. He clearly wants to put the focus on annexation. People like Mike Huckabee, who's going to be the U.S. ambassador to Israel. I'd say David Friedman, who was the ambassador last time. For them, clearly, I think they're more interested in the annexation issue. I think there's some tension within where the priority is. But if I had to bet, I would think for Donald Trump, you know, the idea that he could win a Nobel Prize for bringing this about is something huge. Now, so that leaves me in my final sense to say, where's Netanyahu? I think Netanyahu likes toying with the annexation like he did in 2020, but ultimately he traded for it. When he could get the Abraham Accords with the United Arab Emirates, who said our condition is no annexation for 4 years, he goes, okay, no annexation. I think he'll toy with it now as a bargaining chip, but I think if push came to shove, he would trade in the chips if he could get a deal with Saudi Arabia. But clearly he's going to want Trump and MBS to try to eliminate as much as possible on the Palestinian side, say, I can't commit to 2 states, will commit not to annex. So will that work? You know, we don't know yet. But these are the 4 big points, I think: Gaza stabilization, Lebanon, Iran, and the tie-in between the West Bank with with the Saudi mega deal. That's how I see 2025. I could go on and on for hours on each of these points, but don't want to talk too long, and I want to thank you all for listening, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, David. And up next, we have Dana Stroul, the Director of Research and the Shelly and Michael Kassen Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. She previously served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East and the Pentagon's top civilian official with responsibility for the region. In that capacity, she led the development and execution of the U.S. defense policy in the Middle East during an especially turbulent period that included accelerating integrated air and maritime defense, addressing Iran's destabilizing activities, formulating the U.S. approach to strategic competition, sustaining the Defeat ISIS coalition, and responding to the Israel-Hamas war. Her impressive resume continues, as she has also worked as a senior professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, in the Middle East Policy Office of the Secretary of Defense, at the U.S. Embassy in Cairo on economic political affairs, at the U.S. Institute of Peace on civilian-military relations in Iraq, and at the National Democratic Institute on Gulf Affairs. We're incredibly grateful to have Ms. Stroul and her expertise with us here today. Dana?
Well, first of all, thank you so much to the DMFI family for inviting me today, together with my colleague David. You all do incredibly important work, and so I'm pleased to be able to share some thoughts with you all today. David projected out on some of the big policy issues that will confront both Israel and the Trump administration in 2025. And so I thought perhaps to frame the rest of the conversation, I would revisit some of the key policy decisions with respect to the first Trump administration, some of the key policy decisions with respect to Israel in the Biden administration, and then what this means for important decisions that the Trump administration will need to make, the second Trump administration in 2025 and going into 2026. So first of all, from Trump 1, a lot of the key decisions that were made that moved the policy ball forward with respect to Israel actually remain in place. Here are some of the wave tops. Moving the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The labeling of products coming from the West Bank as made in Israel. Recognizing the Golan as under Israeli sovereignty. These are areas that the Biden administration did not unwind or dismantle. So that policy architecture remains in place today. There's also, of course, the Abraham Accords between Israel and the UAE, between Israel and Bahrain, between Israel and Morocco, remain in effect, and many of them are actually either maintaining or warming up today, despite a lot of frustration in the rest of the Middle East with the Israeli prosecution of its wars against Hamas in Gaza and its war against Hezbollah in Lebanon. What is also remains but was not put into place, of course, was the Trump deal of the century, the Peace to Prosperity Plan, which was probably the historically most generous to the Israeli position on what a possible two-state outcome could look like. And then I think it's important to reflect on the kinds of policy adjustments that were made that were very much supported by Israel during the first Trump administration. For example, the unilateral withdrawal of the United States from the Iran nuclear agreement. And second of all, the halt of U.S. assistance directly to the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. So all of that policy architecture remains in place today. Now let's fast forward and just think about the Biden administration. First of all, prior to the U.S. response to Hamas's October 7th attack and its support for Israel's ability to defend itself, in 2021, the Biden administration championed a $1 billion missile defense supplemental to expand Israel's Iron Dome defense system. This was after the 2021 Operation Guardian of the Walls in Gaza. This year was, of course, the passage of about $14 billion in a national security supplemental that is both for Israel's missile defense, for Israel's military sales, and also for U.S. military operations to be sustained and continued in the Middle East. I think it's also important to note that the Biden administration really adjusted its defense planning and its military investments in the Middle East to increase military posture, to both actively participate in the defense of Israel. For example, in April of this year, in putting together an air defense coalition after the first direct Iranian attack on Israel. And then in October, during Iran's October 1st ballistic missile attack on Israel, we actually had U.S. Navy assets participating in the defense of Israel and shooting down Iranian missiles. Not to mention the elevated posture across the entire Middle East and an aircraft carrier group in the Middle East, basically nonstop since October 7th until just recently in the past couple days. I think it's also important to reflect on the stand that clearly President Biden views as morally righteous in Israel's insistence in Israel's right to defend itself from terror on, at this point, 7 different fronts. That includes things like vetoing UN Security Council resolutions that would seek to impose a unilateral, unconditional ceasefire on Israel without also demanding the release of the remaining Israeli hostages held by Hamas in Gaza, and the constant diplomatic work that you've seen the Biden team do to stand up for Israel across the different international fora. So now, just to accelerate and think through some of the key decisions that the second Trump administration will need to make. The first one is whether or not to sustain this increase in U.S. military posture in the Middle East, either to support Israel's defense or to participate in deterring Iran, or even potentially to participate alongside Israel in further military options inside Iranian territory. The decision of manpower and resources in that military investment in the Middle East will be a critical decision that the Trump administration will need to weigh very early in the administration. And I would note here, especially given what we hear from many members of the foreign policy team around Donald Trump, that want to make sure they are prioritizing China and the threatening role that they see China playing both in the Asia theater and globally. So again, this balancing act of what stays in the Middle East versus other global priorities for the U.S. military. Number 2 is whether or not that integration of Israel into the Middle East. So I should have noted from the first Trump administration that Israel was moved from our European area of responsibility, EUCOM, into CENTCOM, the part of our U.S. military that's responsible for organizing our military operations in the Middle East. The Biden team saw this as very positive and actually worked to very quickly deepen and strengthen Israel's military ties with U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, but also to facilitate Israel's military integration with longstanding U.S. Arab partners across the Middle East. So whether or not the Trump team is going to invest again in this multilateral military integration, more multilateral air defense, that takes defense diplomacy muscle and political diplomatic muscle. So it would need to be a priority. Other ones that I want to just quickly mention, whether or not to sustain, Israel remains the highest recipient of U.S. military assistance globally, higher than any other U.S. ally or partner. So that's a significant investment of U.S. taxpayer support for Israel's security and its ability to defend itself. And we see these kinds of this kind of support very hotly debated right now in the U.S. Congress. And so that outlay of resources is something that the Trump administration will need to decide if they continue. And I would note this because there's also a lot of camp within the Trump team that is very focused on America at home and an isolationist trend, and questioning whether it is worthwhile and value added for the United States to be so involved globally. Another one that the Trump administration will need to decide is whether or not it will continue what has been a decades-long bipartisan commitment to maintaining Israel's qualitative military edge. We have a lot of U.S. Arab partners across the Middle East who would like to continue buying American weapon systems, but they see what Israel has. They see how Israel has used those military capabilities since October 7th to reset the Middle East in terms of Iran deterrence and collapsing its adversaries in Hezbollah and Hamas. And a lot of our Arab partners are going to want to have conversations with the Trump team about what other military acquisitions they want, and balancing that with Israel's ability to have the best military equipment is a political decision and a national security decision that the Trump team will need to make. And finally, with the announcement of the nomination of Elise Stefanik to the U.S. representative to the United Nations, I expect that the very strong U.S. stance across the United Nations, the Security Council, other bodies, and in international fora will remain quite robust. But this is an area where, again, it will be a decision about whether the Trump team will want to invest the kind of diplomatic muscle necessary to continue standing up for Israel. And final point here is Congress. Today, I'm sure we'll talk later in the discussion about Senator Sanders' joint resolutions of disapproval that should be voted on at some point today with respect to military sales to Israel. But what this, I think, should signal is that what has been for several administrations, long-standing bipartisan support for Israel is beginning to fray. And there will be important decisions for the Trump administration as to whether or not maintaining that bipartisan consensus on the strategic value of the U.S.-Israel relationship is going to be a priority. And if it is going to be a priority, the Trump team is going to need to take time to consult not just with the Republican caucuses in the Senate and the House of Representatives, but also with the Democratic side. I'll stop there. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Dana, thank you so much. David, thank you. Ed, thank you for the wonderful introductions. If folks would like to submit a question, please put it there in the Q&A. And I will try to get to as many of them as I can. And if you're joining us through some other platform, go ahead and put it in the comment section. We're monitoring those. I think I would maybe like take a moment to talk about this Bernie Sanders resolution the Senate's voting on today that would block security aid to Israel. DMFI has been opposing this strongly through our grassroots and other networks, through our relationships on the Hill. We've noticed there's some senators, some Democratic senators are making what we believe is a misleading and maybe disingenuous point about the difference between offensive and defensive weapons. They say, well, we want Israel to have defensive weapons, but not offensive weapons. But is that a blurry line, Dana? Does such a distinction really exist?
I think it is a blurry line, and it is absolutely a gray space. And what one may define on a certain day as offensive, somebody else will define as defensive. So the most straightforward example here is, why is Israel engaged in these military campaigns in Gaza to dismantle Hamas and in Lebanon to dismantle Hezbollah? It's because those are two non-state actors, terrorist organizations backed by Iran, who have kept Israel under threat and launched acts of war against Israel. So what Israel is doing to dismantle these military organizations is an act of self-defense, so that the territory of Israel and Israeli civilians can be safe in their own country. I think it's also important to think about some of the specific weapon systems that these resolutions of disapproval are targeting. One are precision-guided munitions, which essentially are kits that can make a bomb that could target indiscriminately more precise, which is actually exactly what one would want an ally or a partner to do, to take intelligence about an area. What is the enemy in the area? What is the potential collateral damage or civilian casualties in an area, and make sure that a strike, a target, a bomb is as precise as possible. That happens with precision guided munitions kits, which is one of the things on the table right now being targeted by the Sanders resolution. And while I do think it's important to point out, as Rachel noted, that this offensive versus defensive is a blurry line, the strategic picture on this vote is equally as important. So we have a Biden White House administration official on the ground in Lebanon earlier this week, in Israel today, in a high stakes negotiation to bring about a ceasefire in Lebanon with Hezbollah. We have Iran, who has broken with past precedent for decades, launched 2 direct attacks against Israel in 1 calendar year, one with 180 ballistic missiles, not less, a little more than a month ago, and Israel under constant threat from other fronts. A vote like this will likely empower and embolden those adversaries to say, see, the political tune in Washington is changing. There's distancing between the United States and Israel. There's daylight. Now's the time actually for us to ramp up and pile on. So I think that at this point in time, if one actually values transitioning from military operations to political processes and getting those ceasefires in place, now is not the time to have these votes that are going to signal in an absolutely unambiguous way that there is daylight between the U.S. and Israel.
Thanks, Dana. David, please, if you have anything to add there, but I'll also throw another question at you. You mentioned in your open remarks that you think it's possible that Israeli government could announce a winding down of the major operations that were in response to the October 7th, 2023 attacks. What could you imagine that look like? We know there's still 100 and some hostages being held in Gaza. Could that happen with the release of those hostages?
No, yeah, no, thank you for that, Rachel. And I think Dana did great in responding to your first question. So I'll stick to your second one. Look, I think this is the needle Israel's trying to thread is that I think Trump clearly says, wrap it up and, get the job done. So he would like to come into office. Look, if this was 1981 and, with the hostages in Iran, but Iran was a state and Hamas is a terrorist organization, they gave the hostages to the new president within 20 minutes of Ronald Reagan taking the oath of office. I don't see that happening here because Hamas doesn't have the logic of a state. And so I don't see that deal happening. I think Israel would like to, be responsive to a new president to say we're listening to you, but we're not going to pull out until we got our hostages back. And so I think Israel's going to try to find a balancing act between. Anyway, it's like I said in my remarks that they have a fraction of the soldiers they had last year, and even up to the Rafah time, even by Rafah, they didn't have that many soldiers, and now they have less. I mean, Hamas as an army is not what it was. They busted up, 24 of these battalions, but Hamas is still a threat, and it's, getting into, it was a terrorist group and insurgency. So I think Israel's saying, look, can't leave Lebanon to get the hostages out and until you deal with the insurgency. My fear, though, is, frankly, Rachel, is that the fear here is, for me, is that, if you want to defeat Hamas you have to compete with Hamas. You don't get something for free. If there's a vacuum, it's like Mogadishu, as someone said, Mogadishu on the Mediterranean, chaos. And the army in Israel, Tzahal, they like to pride themselves that they prepare for the day after that. But the prime minister doesn't want to allow them to do that because he doesn't want to anger Smotrich and Ben-Gvir by bringing the PA back in. So you're in this gray zone of where, maybe you don't have the wars against Gaza City and Khan Yunis and Rafah and what was, but you're not out yet. You also hopefully it gives you some bargaining chip on the hostages issue. You don't know that, but Israel has not been able to do what David Petraeus has said, which is you clear an area, you hold an area, and you build an area. Israel's in Jabalia for the 4th time. they're not clearing and holding. And so I think it's a somewhat of a balancing act. And I don't say that in a great way. I think the Army would love to prepare and say, here, we're turning it over to Mr. X, if it's the PA or whoever it is. And I don't think, and the Prime Minister hasn't agreed to that at this point. So the Army is in a very tough spot in this regard, in trying to do Gaza stabilization. And then there's the issue we haven't talked about is the Arab states. And I think for someone like the Emirates, their view is, you want us to put all this money into Gaza and reconstruction and billions of dollars, but we only want to put money into something where we know where the money's going. And unless we have faith that the PA has been, renewed under an empowered prime minister like Fayyad, we're not going to put this money in. So I don't know where you're going to get all the money to rebuild Gaza. So there's multiple issues here of what comes after the fighting. And I don't feel that the answers yet are in place, partly because of the politics there in Israel. It's a very complex situation. I don't think things are in a great place. Israel trying to reduce the number of troops consistently, but it needs a plan who it's turning the area over to.
Thanks, David. I have a broader question submitted. What can we expect out of the Trump-Netanyahu relationship in general?
Look, I think first of all, Trump, I don't know, Dana, she thinks, I think that Trump, I gotta say this diplomatically, I think he prides himself on his unpredictability. I think a second-term president, by definition, doesn't have the electoral constraints of someone who has to run for re-election. So it's like unpredictability on steroids in a certain way. People think that they're all buddies. I remember saying this on the PBS NewsHour. I mean, they hadn't spoken for almost 4 years because after a week, after Biden won, Trump was incensed. Then Netanyahu called to congratulate him. Now I found out there were 28 heads of state ahead of Netanyahu, but it didn't change things for the president, or then it was the former president. So I don't think Netanyahu is so confident in that relationship. I think he is hoping that he could hook the president on a Saudi mega deal. I think he sees that as a huge project. I think he would also like to have some baseline understandings, like I said, on Iran and some of the other points I made. But I don't think he is so confident in that relationship as he projects outwardly. That's my own view, but Dana may disagree.
I would just note here, first of all, the personal relationship between the two men is clearly warm at this time. And I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu, of course, is going to see value in trying to keep it warm. U.S. allies and partners, as well as U.S. adversaries, very well remember the first Trump administration, which is that things can change very quickly. The president can wake up, or the president-elect can wake up, see something on the TV, read something he doesn't like, issue a tweet, and all of a sudden the policy team around the president is trying to reverse engineer policy and resource decisions to match what he decided on a whim or an instinct, not necessarily informed by a deliberative progressive national security decision-making process. And so I think while there is a feeling both in Israel with Prime Minister Netanyahu and those close to him, as well as in the Arab capitals, I should note here, that Trump is someone they know, they're familiar with the kinds of deals that he wants to make, what he values. There is also a recognition that it can be unpredictable, which in some ways might work well for deterrence and confronting adversaries, but doesn't work very well when it comes to alliance and partner maintenance and growth. And then again, part of this is going to be what the resource decisions are here. And for Israel, what works for Israel's security is a very robust U.S. military presence in the region. What works for Israel's security calculations is very active U.S. involvement in things that they care about, like keeping pressure on Iran. The question, I think, is can the team around Trump do those things? And they are going to have very real resource decisions to make about whether or not to use the U.S. military in this active way that the Biden administration has done to support Israel's defense. There will be very real decisions to make about whether, how, and when to use more military force against Iran, given how exposed they are after Israeli operations, as David noted, to take out the air defense. And what Trump has also been very clear about is that he doesn't want the U.S. military involved in another war. And so there will be a risk calculation inside the Trump administration that may not turn out the way Prime Minister Netanyahu wants. And I also think that team recognizes that. And so this will be a balancing act, relationship management.
Thanks, Dana. Dana, I'm going to throw the next one to you. Of course, President Biden still has a couple of months left in his administration. What can we expect? We saw, I believe it was yesterday, his administration was outspoken against these Sanders resolutions that we know are being voted on in the Senate today. What else should we expect to see?
We have three great indications of the Biden administration's approach in this lame duck period. The first is that the U.S. wielded its veto power at the Security Council this morning to vote down a resolution, as I noted in my earlier remarks, that would have called for a unilateral unconditional ceasefire without also calling for the condition of the hostages held by Hamas in Gaza to be released. Number two is the really active posture of this White House, of the Biden White House, to express its opposition to the Sanders resolutions of disapproval against these arms transfers to Israel. This is the Biden team saying our policy is that Israel needs these weapon systems, not only to defend itself now, but defend itself in the future. And we are laying the groundwork for arms transfers to Israel for years to come. And the Biden administration is owning that policy decision by leaning on members of the president's party to oppose that resolution. And number three is before the November 5th election, there was a letter sent by Secretary of State Tony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin to Israel, expressing deep concerns that Israel was not doing enough to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid to Palestinian civilians in need in Gaza, and threatened that at risk was ongoing U.S. support to Israel because Israel would be in violation of certain areas of U.S. law for partners to receive assistance if Israel didn't make some adjustments. And what's clear is that this administration believes that Israel has made sufficient adjustments to continue to receive U.S. military assistance. So to me, these are all indicators that the Biden team is not going to be seriously changing its policy on Israel in this lame duck period, and is going to be leaning into doing what it can so that Israel has the defensive support it needs and has the confidence to transition from military operations to political processes.
Thanks, Dana. David, please feel free to add to that if you'd like, or I can throw another question your way.
I think it's very good. I would add maybe a fourth, although we don't see it, we don't know it yet, but on the issue, there have been some that wanted to use the lame duck to sanction two Israeli cabinet ministers. It's not, you don't take this lightly to sanction a cabinet of an ally, or at least members of the Israeli cabinet. I think so far the administration is sticking to sanctioning people either engaged in violence or organizations now like Amanah. I'm going to hopefully be doing a tweet thread on this shortly, that on groups that, while maybe not engaged in violence itself, maybe have subsidiaries that are supportive of it or involved in maybe, expelling Palestinians from land in certain areas. So I don't see the administration doing what, some in Europe have been urging it to do, which is to use the lame duck to kick it up to the cabinet level. Right now I don't see indications of it, although, this goes on through January, but I tend to think what Dana is saying is accurate, that there's a clear pattern here of like, this is where Biden stands. and he's not going to be, diplomatically cornered by Europeans, Arabs, others to say things at the Security Council and other places that he doesn't want to do. He wants to complete the office the way he's been conducting since October 7th.
Thanks, David. David, we have a question from Nissan. Are you concerned about newly empowered isolationist tendencies negatively affecting the U.S.-Israel relationship?
I am a bit. I mean, I don't know if J.D. Vance, the vice president, or, Tucker Carlson, who seems to sometimes have the ear of the president-elect. I find it hard to believe that you could be an isolationist when it comes to 199 countries, but be an interventionist when it comes to Israel. I tend to think that you can't keep those two things separate. I was heartened. I thought, someone like Marco Rubio, more of the traditional mold of Republicans as Secretary of State, suggested that it wasn't going to be an isolationist. I think the National Security Advisor that is being named also in that regard. So some of the appointments, don't fit the isolationist mold, but I don't know if it's clear. I think someone like Pompeo was excluded because he was too much of a traditionalist in this regard. And again, you could like him, not like him. I'm not here to endorse anybody, but so I thought on some of the national security appointments, for the most part, the isolationists have not, what some people would call the Rick Grinnell wing, has not really done well in national security, and people should not be as worried. But I do think that this is a wing of the Republican Party, and it's something that you cannot dismiss. Of course, the Democrats also have a wing of the party that is not interventionist either, on its more on the further left. So there's no guarantees on either side. The appointments so far seem not to reflect the isolationism, but I don't rule it out. And you never know what, over a 4-year period, how the winds kind of shift and move. And, you never say never. But right now, I don't think the isolationists can be happy with the appointments that have been announced so far in the national security space. But I think it's something to be watchful for.
Thank you. Dana, can you talk to us about the memorandum of understanding? Maybe explain it for the folks listening. It was, of course, signed in the Obama-Biden administration, and it will need to be renewed or re-upped in some fashion.
Absolutely. So the Memorandum of Understanding for Security Assistance to Israel, the Obama administration negotiated a new 10-year MOU, or Memorandum of Understanding. That MOU started in 2017 and will end in 2028. And it contains multiple elements. One is military aid, $3.3 billion per year. So this is what keeps Israel at the highest level of recipient across all U.S. allies and partners for military aid. It also includes $500 million a year for missile defense funding for Israel. And then it also has a unique element that only Israel receives, which is something called offshore procurement, which allows Israel to use this U.S. funding, so taxpayer dollars, not for U.S. systems directly subsidizing U.S. defense industry, but a portion of this money Israel can use to procure from Israeli defense industry. So we are also supporting the development and cutting edge work of Israel's defense industry. So that's nearly $3.4 billion per year. And again, I just want to reflect that in the past 4 years, there's also been an additional $1 billion supplemental for missile defense funding. And this year, $14 billion in this military assistance for Israel that was part of this bigger national security supplemental. So that current 10-year agreement expires in 2028, which means that the Trump administration will actually want to start negotiating much earlier than that in order to have an agreement. And here, I just want to reflect what David said about the isolationist wing versus the engagement wing of 2 different camps in the Trump administration. there are a lot of Americans, I can say this as a former Senate staffer, who it's not about questioning aid to Israel or Ukraine or any country. It's why are we giving funding to other partners? Shouldn't we be spending this money at home? And Israel looks like it's doing pretty well in terms of its ability to defend itself, its operations against Hezbollah and Iran and Hamas. So there could be a big debate about whether or not to continue transferring this level of money to Israel. There could be a debate about whether or not Israel should continue to get to spend U.S. taxpayer dollars in Israel as opposed to here in the United States. So there are all sorts of elements around what that negotiation could look like. I will note here one inherent tension. With the Trump team and in the campaign, there was a lot of talk of dismantling the deep state or all of these civil servants who work in the State Department and the Defense Department and our intelligence community to keep the wheels of the national security apparatus turning. These guys are actually the experts who know how to allocate the money, how to facilitate spending this money through U.S. government contracts in U.S. defense industry or Israeli defense industry, how to negotiate these things. So at a time when there might actually be tremendous pressure on the civilians and even the military inside the U.S. government will be happening at the same time that the Trump administration will need to work on these very high stakes and very technical arrangements like another memorandum of understanding with Israel. And so this, again, I think is a big question about how these issues play out.
Thank you. That's fascinating. David, you touched on some of Trump's picks for various roles. We are getting a number of questions about a few particular picks and folks he's surrounding himself with as advisors. Elon Musk, we have a question. Given Elon Musk's influence, what role do you see him playing in shaping U.S. policy in the Middle East? Question about Tulsi Gabbard, and a question about Mike Huckabee that Trump has selected as a possible U.S. ambassador to Israel. So jump ball, just interested in anybody's thoughts on any of those folks.
Look, on Musk, I have no insight. I mean, the guy has been incredibly, he seems to he just sticks like glue to, Trump's side. He gave $175 million in the state of Pennsylvania during the last days of the campaign. Trump is clearly appreciative of him. Trump went to Texas to see his space launch, I believe, yesterday. I mean, I have no idea. Anything could happen, I guess, but I tend to think the guy to watch still on the Middle East is the guy who's not going to be in government is Kushner. I think that he's going to have it always. He's going to be the key guy. And like I said in my remarks, I think, and you mentioned Huckabee, I think that the tension within is, are you going to go here for normalization or annexation? That's the core. And the Kushner wing, so to speak, is going to want to go for normalization. While I would say Huckabee/Friedman is going to go for, annexation. They don't really, Friedman has told people quietly, I don't care about normalization. This is a once in a multi-generational moment to annex the land. That's biblical. And I think Huckabee is going to be at the same spot. Why did he name him? I'm told that Huckabee is very close to Miriam Adelson, who gave $100 million to the Trump campaign. I think, anyway, but I think she's also, by the way, I think close to Marco Rubio too, I should say. But I think that tension is, I wouldn't focus on Elon Musk. I would focus on Kushner. And I think, we haven't mentioned Witkoff was like the Trump golf buddy. I think he's also in the kind of Kushner orbit. And while he's called the coordinator for the Middle East for Trump on peace issues, I expect him to be very aligned with Kushner. So I think you might have mentioned a third name, but I think whether Musk, I really have nothing. I mean, that's a wild card. I really have nothing to add there. Oh, on Tulsi Gabbard, I don't know. I mean, I'm very concerned about this. I'm told by a guy who was a former director of the CIA, who I spoke to the other day, and he just said, look, the DNI position is more administrative. It's more internal management issues. than it is kind of the raw intelligence and spycraft that we associate with the CIA, but still very influential. She has said very nice things about Assad and about Putin. So that seems to me a very unusual choice as well. We'll see what the confirmation situation is like, but I think in the meantime, Matt Gaetz seems to be kind of, sucking up all the oxygen in the media space about is he or won't he be confirmed? But I think you're right to raise her name.
Rachel, can I make a few quick points on this issue?
Please.
So first of all, with respect to Elon Musk, these are early days for this foreign policy team. They're not actually sitting together, coordinating, or talking to each other about how certain self-enterprising initiatives might undermine what actual policy is. So with respect to Trump and Iran, last week there was, or maybe it was earlier this week, news that Elon Musk had a meeting with the Iranian permanent representative to the United Nations. So a meeting with an Iranian official. The Trump administration has yet to articulate exactly what its policy toward Iran is. So it's talked about resuming this maximum pressure campaign, which is a real big pressure campaign on Iran, which did during the first Trump administration reduce very significantly its ability to export its oil and constrain Iran's economy. But that is a tactic, not an end state in and of itself. So what the Trump team has yet to articulate, and I'm sure at some point when they are seated in office, they will, are they seeking to eliminate Iran's nuclear program, roll it back, constrain it? Maximum pressure campaign does not work if it's the United States alone. It only works if others in the Middle East, if China and the Europeans are working with us to impose massive economic pressure on Iran. The Trump administration has not articulated exactly how it's going to work with Israel, with others, to address Iran's continued cultivation of terrorists and proxies globally. So there are a bunch of unanswered questions, and not knowing what the policy framework is, to have any one official having questions, we don't know what the messages that were passed, what that looks like, that is very risky. At a time of, I think, heightened risk for what Iran and what the regime in Tehran is thinking, what Israel's thinking with respect to its own security situation. Number two, the position of the Director of National Intelligence is quite important. So that office is the one that is setting the intelligence priorities for the rest of the community. And number two, that individual is making decisions about how we interpret that intelligence, at times how you might want to downgrade certain elements of intelligence to make a point. So here, a very good example is when the Biden administration chose to downgrade a lot of intelligence about Russian plans to invade Ukraine, to educate everybody else about the intelligence that we were seeing. So this is a quite powerful position. And for somebody who has been known to actively promote disinformation from Russia, or to basically associate herself with Bashar al-Assad in Damascus, who dropped chemical weapons on his own people, that's deeply problematic for the kind of leadership that we would want in the U.S. intelligence community, because we would want the leader of our intelligence community to speak with unquestioned authority when we are discussing intelligence. And if that comes into question, then it undermines all U.S. intelligence.
Agreed. And thank you, Dana. Thank you, David. Thank you, Ed. We're so grateful for your friendship and your participation and your sharp insights and observations today. I'm very pleased to turn it over to our board co-chair, Ann Lewis, now to close us out.
Well, thank you, Rachel. And thank you, Ed, to David, to Dana. Always a trusted resource. And we're so glad that we can turn to you. You know, we're talking today about the vote that's coming up soon on the Sanders resolution. Well, if you listened to our program 2 weeks ago, DMFI then was organizing to defeat that attempt by Bernie Sanders to deny Israel the means to defend itself. And we asked for your help. We asked you to write, call your senators, mobilize your friends to join you. We will know the answer soon. But this is the latest example of why DMFI plays a vital role in ensuring that the Democratic Party continues our long, proud pro-Israel tradition, and why we engage in debates inside and outside the party. It's why we showed up at the Democratic National Convention and hosted pro-Israel events. We speak out against misguided anti-Israel actions like this latest set of resolutions. It's why, along with our sister organization, DMFI PAC, we keep the spotlight on anti-Israel members of Congress, as we did with two squad members in this last cycle, who will soon be ex-members. Their constituents deserved better. And I was proud that DMFI PAC ran such effective campaigns against them. Next Monday, December 2nd, we'll be hosting a handful of new members of Congress that DMFI PAC helped support. They'll answer your questions and tell us what's on their agenda. So stay tuned. That's Monday, December 2nd, and it's DMFI PAC presenting some new pro-Israel members. We're already engaged in the latest new round of debate within the Democratic Party. Some of us think this debate has been going on for a long time. But we'll be clear, support for the U.S.-Israel relationship is good policy and good politics. We have the facts and the examples to prove it. So to everyone watching who's already a supporter, thank you for making sure there is a strong pro-Israel, pro-democracy voice within the Democratic Party. And if this is important to you, we hope you'll join us. Meanwhile, please continue to stay in touch. Check in on our website, listen to us on phone, further Zoom programs, email, social media, Twitter, Instagram, and I heard today Blue Sky. Glad we're joining the crowd. We look forward to continuing to work with you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.